They called her the Plastic Princess, a cruel joke that masked an even crueler truth. Barbara Baekland, who married into the fortune built on the world's first synthetic plastic, spent her life trying to mould reality itself into the shape of her desires. From the ashes of her father's passing, she rose to claim a place among Europe's elite, trailing beauty and chaos in equal measure. But in her desperate quest to create perfection, she would forge something monstrous instead. Her story is a gothic tragedy played out in penthouses and palaces, where money couldn't buy sanity, and social connections couldn't protect against the darkness that lurked behind closed doors. By the time the end came, in a blood-stained Chelsea apartment, even those who knew her best would struggle to separate the guilt from the guilt, as we describe the sad socialite whose son took her life. In the glittering world of early 1940s Manhattan, where old money mingled with new industrial fortunes, Barbara Daly was determined to rise above her modest beginnings. Born on the 28th of September 1921, she emerged from childhood carrying both striking beauty and invisible scars, a combination that would prove lethal in the years to come. Beautiful, intelligent and deeply troubled, she had already attempted several times before meeting Brooks Baekland, grandson of Leo Baekland, the inventor of Bakelite, the world's first synthetic plastic. The Baekland name carried the weight of revolution. Leo's invention had transformed modern life, replacing precious materials like ivory and tortoiseshell with something entirely new. The fortune it generated elevated the family to America's industrial aristocracy. Barbara's own history stood in stark contrast to the Baekland legacy. Her father, Frank Daly, a tubercular telegrapher who dreamed of bigger things, took his own life in January 1933 when Barbara was 11. He left behind unpaid bills, unanswered questions, and a daughter who would spend her life trying to outrun his shadow. Her mother's subsequent mental decline cast Barbara adrift in a world she was determined to conquer. But Barbara possessed weapons more potent than wealth, beauty that turned heads and a quick, savage wit that could charm or destroy with equal ease. She graced the pages of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, her exotic looks and theatrical personality drawing attention from painters, photographers, and wealthy admirers. Each step was calculated, each relationship a potential ladder to the life she craved. The meeting with Brooks Baekland in the early 1940s seemed to promise everything she had ever wanted. He was handsome, wealthy, and carried one of America's great industrial names, a perfect target for a woman determined to secure her place in society. Their whirlwind courtship ended in a hasty California wedding after Barbara orchestrated a cunning deception, falsely claiming she was pregnant to force Brooks's hand. From the start, their marriage was built on shaky ground, but they maintained a shining outward appearance. The couple embarked on a life of travel, artistic pursuits, and social prominence that would have seemed impossible during Barbara's difficult childhood. They moved between New York, Paris, and Spain, collecting friends and admirers while spending the seemingly endless Bakelite fortune. On the 28th of August 1946, they welcomed their only child, Anthony Baekland, into a world of tremendous privilege and profound dysfunction. As Barbara took on the role of mother, she found herself facing an unexpected enemy, one that all her beauty and charm couldn't conquer. Deep within the perfect life she had engineered, something dark was taking root. As young Tony grew, those who knew the family well began to notice troubling patterns. Barbara's behavior became increasingly erratic, her moods swinging violently between smothering affection and icy withdrawal. But it wasn't until a particularly lavish party at their Spanish villa that the facade began to crack, revealing glimpses of the horror to come. In that moment of unguarded cruelty, Barbara showed the first signs of an obsession with her son that would ultimately lead them both to destruction. In 1954, when Anthony was 8 years old, the Baeklands abandoned the structure of their New York life for a nomadic existence that would define their next 2 decades. Their lifestyle became the envy of society pages, beautiful people living a seemingly charmed life, drifting between luxury hotels and rented villas across Europe. But within their gilded world, young Anthony was growing up in an atmosphere of increasing psychological violence. Brooks pursued his artistic ambitions half-heartedly, more interested in collecting experiences than creating art. Barbara, meanwhile, fashioned herself as a writer and intellectual, hosting elaborate parties in their Paris apartment where she would recite her poetry to captive audiences. She cultivated relationships with prominent artists and writers, adding their names to her collection of social trophies while her son watched from the shadows. The family's wealth enabled endless travel and constant reinvention. When scandal or boredom threatened in one city, they simply moved to another. They spent summers in Spain, winters in Switzerland, and long stretches in Paris, where they entertained artists and philosophers. But no amount of geographic change could mask the growing instability within their family unit. Barbara's relationship with Anthony became increasingly complex and troubling. She would lavish attention on him one day, then abandon him to the care of servants the next. Her own unresolved trauma from childhood seemed to replay itself in her parenting, creating patterns that would haunt them both. Brooks, witnessing his wife's erratic behaviour, retreated further into his own pursuits and affairs. As Anthony entered adolescence, the first serious signs of trouble emerged. Highly intelligent but deeply sensitive, he struggled in school despite his obvious gifts. Teachers noted his tendency to withdraw into fantasy worlds, while classmates found him strange and difficult to approach. The signs of schizophrenia were becoming apparent to medical professionals, but Brooks refused psychiatric treatment for his son, preferring to ignore the growing crisis. The family's wealth, which might have provided access to the best psychiatric care, instead served to enable their denial. Brooks treated his son's struggles as an inconvenience rather than a medical emergency, while Barbara wove elaborate explanations for his behaviour that grew more fantastic with each passing year. By the early 1960s, the cracks in the family's facade were widening. Anthony's sexuality became a source of intense concern for Barbara, who viewed it as both a personal failure and a threat to the family's social standing. Her reaction to this perceived crisis would set in motion a chain of events that would destroy them all. At a dinner party in their Paris apartment, Barbara made a shocking announcement that silenced her guests and changed the family's trajectory forever. Her solution to what she saw as her son's problem would cross boundaries that even their jaded social circle found unthinkable. As the cognac was being served, she revealed a plan so disturbing that several guests left immediately, never to return. The 1960s marked a devastating turning point for the Baeklands. As Anthony's schizophrenia became more apparent, Barbara's obsession with curing his homosexuality reached dangerous new heights. Her solution, voiced at that fateful Paris dinner party, was to hire prostitutes to sleep with her son, a scheme that horrified even her most libertine acquaintances. But when these arrangements failed to achieve her desired result, Barbara's desperate measures took an even darker turn. In 1967, she crossed a boundary that would forever shatter what remained of their family's stability. Using a combination of manipulation and her son's fragile mental state, Barbara seduced Anthony herself, believing this ultimate taboo would somehow cure him of his homosexuality. Brooks, unable to cope with his wife's increasingly deranged behaviour and the toxic atmosphere she had created, finally fled the marriage in 1968. He found refuge in the arms of a younger woman, Anthony's friend, Sylvie. This abandonment pushed Barbara further into her unhealthy fixation on her son, while Anthony's grip on reality grew increasingly tenuous. The mother-son relationship became a psychological horror show. Barbara would alternate between playing the role of possessive mother and sexual partner, all while maintaining her carefully crafted social facade. Their wealth allowed them to continue moving between expensive hotels and apartments, where their disturbing dynamic played out behind closed doors. Anthony's violent episodes increased in frequency and severity. During one incident, he attempted to throw his mother under the wheels of a moving car. In another, he tried to strangle her. Each time, Barbara would forgive him, refuse to press charges, and pull him back into their toxic orbit. Friends who witnessed these episodes were powerless to intervene, watching in horror as mother and son spiraled further into madness. The world of social privileges that had once seemed to promise them everything now served only to enable their mutual destruction. Barbara used her connections to smooth over violent incidents, while her money ensured that Anthony's increasingly erratic behaviour wouldn't lead to lasting consequences. Despite his diagnosed schizophrenia, Barbara refused to acknowledge the severity of his condition, continuing to interpret his illness through the lens of her own obsessions. By 1972, Anthony's condition had deteriorated to the point where even casual observers could see he was dangerous. His conversations became increasingly incoherent, filled with paranoid delusions and violent fantasies. Yet Barbara, in perhaps her final act of maternal malpractice, insisted on maintaining their twisted relationship. That November found mother and son sharing a small but expensive apartment in London's Chelsea district. Barbara had recently confided to friends that she believed she was finally curing Anthony through their unnatural relationship. She couldn't have known that within days their toxic dynamic would reach its violent conclusion. On the 17th of November 1972, Barbara Baekland's life ended in her London apartment at the hands of her 26-year-old son. The violence that had been building for years, including a chilling attempt to throw her under traffic just months earlier in July, finally culminated in their Chelsea flat, where Anthony stabbed his mother to death with a kitchen knife. She was 51 years old, and in her final moments she faced the devastating consequence of her lifelong obsession. The killing shocked London society, but those who knew the Baeklands well had long feared some violent culmination to their toxic relationship. After the stabbing, Anthony's behaviour was chillingly composed. He called a local Chinese restaurant to order a meal and calmly ate while his mother's body lay nearby. When police finally arrived, they found him in a state of eerie detachment. During his arrest and subsequent questioning, Anthony displayed the profound mental illness that had gone untreated for so long. His statements to police were a disturbing mixture of coherent recollections and delusional ramblings. He spoke about his mother both as a victim and as someone who would eventually return, showing no clear grasp of the finality of his actions. The British press descended on the story with enthusiasm, uncovering the scandalous details of the family history. The saga had everything: wealth, scandal, incest and murder. Barbara's carefully constructed social facade crumbled posthumously as journalists exposed the dark reality behind her glamorous image. The family that had revolutionized the modern world through the invention of Bakelite was now notorious for something far more sinister. Anthony's trial revealed the full extent of his mental illness. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, he was committed to Broadmoor Hospital, Britain's highest security psychiatric facility. The grandson of one of America's greatest inventors would spend the next 8 years in the same institution that had housed some of Britain's most dangerous, mentally ill patients. Brooks Baekland, who had escaped the toxic family dynamic years earlier, remained distant from his son's legal troubles, focusing on his new life with Sylvie. The wealth and privilege that had once seemed to protect the family now only amplified their tragedy. In 1980, after 8 years at Broadmoor, a group of Anthony's friends successfully lobbied for his release, despite strong objections from psychiatrists who considered him still dangerous. The decision to release him came with one crucial stipulation: he would be deported to America immediately. Just 6 days after arriving in New York, Anthony attempted to attack his grandmother with a kitchen knife, proving his doctor's fears well-founded. As he was arrested once again, it became clear that the Baekland tragedy was racing toward an even darker conclusion. After attacking his grandmother on the 27th of July 1980, just 6 days following his release from Broadmoor, Anthony Baekland found himself incarcerated at Rikers Island. On the 20th of March 1981, the day he expected to be released on bail, his case was delayed due to complications in transferring his medical records from Britain. That same day, in his cell at Rikers Island, Anthony took his own life using a plastic bag. A dark irony, given his grandfather's invention that had made plastic ubiquitous in modern life. He was 33 years old when he died, bringing to an end a family line that had transformed the modern world through innovation, only to destroy itself through dysfunction. His death marked the final chapter in a tragedy that had begun with his mother's fatal obsession decades earlier. Today, the Baekland tragedy stands as both a cautionary tale and a stark reminder of how wealth and privilege can enable, rather than prevent, family destruction. The once illustrious name, synonymous with one of the 20th century's greatest inventions, became forever linked with one of its most notorious family crimes. Their story would later spark controversy with the 2007 film Savage Grace, starring Julianne Moore. The film's portrayal of events was strongly contested by several people involved in the real story, including Samuel Adams Green, who objected to how the film depicted certain aspects of the tragedy. The Baekland legacy now serves as a haunting reminder of the devastating consequences of untreated mental illness and toxic family relationships. Their wealth, which might have provided access to help and healing, instead enabled decades of dysfunction and denial. The social connections that could have intervened remained silent, bound by the unwritten rules of their privileged world. And now I'd like to see you in the comments. Had you heard this tragic story? And what is your opinion on the Baekland family's legacy? I look forward to hearing from you, and thanks again for joining another episode of Old Money Allure. And cheers.